Hey there, all you cool cats and kittens. This is Shane Lemaster coming at you today. Before we get into the presentation, I just added this slide last minute and I wanted to just highlight a couple things that are going on that you have all possibly heard about in your own news feeds and things like that. These are some really significant and very historical monumental, actually, efforts going on just within the last couple weeks um, towards reforming drug policy. Some really cool stuff, and it's an amazing time to be witness to what's going on right now, and especially living here in Colorado. If you're still here, if you've gone home, congratulations. But if you're still here in Colorado during this, during these monumental things, it really feels amazing to be sort of like an epicenter where other states take notice and they start reforming their policies, and it's just an amazing time to be alive if you're really interested in drug policy, and I am. Within the last few weeks, some of you guys might have noticed. Let's start with the green box. So Colorado passed a law last year to defelonize drugs, and this is a statewide law, so it's not just contained to Denver, but it passed and effectively went into effect last month. And so defelonization means that it doesn't make drugs legal, but it does reduce the minimum penalties on some of these drugs. So initially, and the way it's been for a long time, people will get arrested with very small amounts of personal use drugs, and they may be illegal, you know, for any number of reasons why people are using them. Therapeutically, addiction, all sorts of things, experimentation. But you would get caught with small amounts and be sentenced to insane jail times, way off the Richter scale, and really inappropriate. So the law changed, and now if you get caught with 4 grams or less of almost any substance, and I put this in brackets because initially the law was supposed to be any substance, but since it's gone into effect, there have been a number of additions made to it, modifications to the law that specify a few drugs that are not covered under this defelonization. So I know one of those drugs is recreational ketamine. So if someone gets caught with any amount of ketamine, it's still considered a felony, which is a very interesting case, and that's sort of what I'm studying in my dissertation work, is ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, and that's a very interesting one because even the World Health Organization and the FDA and the UN have all considered and announced that ketamine is a breakthrough drug for physical and mental health, and yet it's still considered by some who are creating some of these laws as more dangerous than others when it has such high potential therapeutic value. So some interesting interplays as this unfolds, but defelonization is a great step in the right direction, in my opinion, and we'll learn more about that in the presentation. Another thing that you guys might have been exposed to amidst this this coronavirus quarantine is this happened at the beginning of this month or at the end of March, where for a day, initially, the governor closed down non-essential businesses. And in that very first day, alcohol, liquor stores, and cannabis dispensaries were not on that list of essential stores. And, you would have been so surprised. I was out driving that day, and there's a bunch of cannabis stores up in North Fort Collins, and just driving by there were lines of cars, like 100, 200 cars in line, and people lined up outside the door, all 6 feet apart from each other, hundreds of people. The day that this was announced that it was going to be non-essential, so everybody rushed out. Huge boom in cannabis sales that day, and people were just going nuts, sort of like what happened with the toilet paper thing. Everybody needed to make sure they got their medicine. And so it was supposed to happen the next day that these were going to close down, and there was a huge uproar from the people. Lots of people writing their senators and their congressmen and all these government officials. And because of the public outcry, very next day, Governor Polis reversed that and made cannabis and liquor stores considered them essential businesses. And you might be asking, like, yeah, so what? No big deal. Well, this is really huge, actually, because for the first time, it gets us to start to think about what drugs are in our society and what roles they play in the current culture and society, and maybe even motivate us to look back into history and see what have been different motivations for drug use and different perspectives on it. But currently, I think it's interesting how it's considered essential. I've included an article here that you can check out. It's a really quick read on Newsweek, but it talks about this whole perspective of addiction. And not only, do people self-medicate with cannabis and alcohol, but oftentimes people will get addicted to either one. Psychologically addicted to cannabis. It's helpful for a lot of people's management of their mental health and physical health needs, chronic pain, things like that. And then people medicate with alcohol too, and especially with alcohol, become dependent. And if these liquor stores were to close, imagine the amount of suffering, and so many people who are dependent on alcohol day to day would just there'd be collapses all over the place. The emergency room visits for withdrawal symptoms and withdrawing from alcohol is deadly would just go through the roof. So those were some of the underpinnings of why they were considered essential medicines during this time. But really interesting that for one day in 2020, cannabis and alcohol were back in prohibition during this quarantine. And again, very quickly, we see that prohibition did not work. The people stood up and made that known for sure. All this being considered essential in our state and in other states in the country, people are still being incarcerated to this day. This morning, before you watched this presentation, people were being incarcerated for, what in other states is considered an essential drug, right? So very interesting, that interplay. And the last little link here I just wanted to provide for you is a policy reform group that I came across, and they are brand new to the scene as far as making a huge impact and really helping pass progressive drug policy laws. So go check them out, and hope you guys like the presentation. Hi everybody, and welcome to today's presentation on drug policy. Again, my name is Shane Lemaster. I'm a PhD student here in the School of Social Work. And first, I just want to say thank you for joining me online today. This is not only my first teaching experience at the university level, but definitely my first teaching experience through a venue that I'm not very familiar with, which is technology. I'm not the most technically savvy, and I think we're all learning how to do this. So I appreciate you all being here, and I hope you like the presentation. So I posted a couple things on this week's module for you to take a look at. They can also come in handy if you pull it up next to this presentation in order to access some of the links for the videos or some of the diagrams that I've included. And also note that there's an assignment attached to this week's module. We're 10 points. I'll get into that later in the presentation, but I've also posted instructions in the discussion board for you all. So I hope you enjoy. All right, so first let's go over some agenda items for today, just sort of the flow of the presentation and how it's going to go. So first I'll have an activity for you all that I hope you enjoy. It's one that I was introduced by another professor in our department, Dr. Shannon Hughes, around this idea of what are drugs. And I know that may sound obvious, but hopefully it'll be interesting for you when we move on to that. Followed by a historical overview, and this is just going to be a brief overview. We're only going to be scratching the surface of the history behind drug policy in the United States. And I'll give you some really prominent political movements that have happened over time as well around this topic. And I just want to let you know that the issue of drug policy here in the U.S. and globally, that's a really deep rabbit hole, and we could, I've taken entire courses on drugs in U.S. society, and it has been very rich and very full, very informing. So just so you know, that rabbit hole is really deep. We're only going to be taking just a quick glance through that looking glass at that rabbit hole, and hopefully you can walk away from this presentation with a little bit more understanding of where these policies come from, how they were initiated, what were some of the factors that were not necessarily seen that went into the creation of them, and some better ideas moving forward. So as you can see, third down on the list, we'll go into some of the propaganda and some of the untold histories. This has been some of my favorite literature to get into over the years, just looking into what we're not told in history, and we'll get into that. And then I want to take us a little bit more broad and go into some international drug policy and start to take a look at how other countries are doing their drug policy, and have you guys reflect on this idea in a critical analysis assignment. This is that 10-point assignment I was talking about. Have you guys really reflect on some of these international policies that are happening that show different effectiveness in different domains, and how that might inform our own drug policies in this country moving forward. I'll also provide you guys with a list of links at the end for additional resources, other websites that I've found useful if you are interested in going further down that rabbit hole. So the first thing we're going to do is sort of open up our minds, broaden our perspectives, and really set the stage, really prime ourselves for what information is to come, and how we're going to want to digest it with a critical lens. So in this activity, I just like to call it "What Are Drugs?" It's a very simple title, but doesn't lead you into understanding really what it's about. So we're going to be taking a look at belief systems and social conditioning around how we, in our own minds, classify drugs. So throughout this slide, I'm going to be asking you to pause the presentation at times in order to take some time, do the activity, and reflect on it. So when I ask you to go ahead and pause the audio and video narrative, go ahead and do that so that you can fully participate in this activity. I promise you it's well worth it, and it's a great reflexive practice that can benefit you not only in this class but also throughout the rest of your academic career and beyond. So if you look to the right of your screen, you're going to notice 4 columns: drug, medicine, passion, and problem. And below it, you're going to notice just a list of substances or activities. What I'd like you to do in the first step is I want you to get just a separate sheet of paper and make these 4 columns on this piece of paper: drug, medicine, passion, and problem. And I want you to go ahead and pause the presentation and spend about 5 to 7 minutes placing each of the terms into one of the columns on the table that you feel it fits best. And go ahead and pause the presentation right now and give that a try. Okay, once you have completed this first part of the assignment and you have all of the items below into one column or another, you might notice that some of them overlap into different columns. Some of them may be listed in multiple columns. But in this second portion of the activity, I'd like you to just sit back at your list, the one that you just created, and spend about 5 to 7 minutes, again, in this reflexive practice, asking yourself, why did I place each term in the column that I did? Why did I designate such and such as a drug and not a medicine, and vice versa? Why did I think that this was a problem and this one is not a problem? Just spend a little bit of time right now. Go ahead and pause the presentation and reflect on why you placed each term in the column that you did. Okay, and when you come back, please just sit with what you've just learned about yourself. That lesson that you've just learned is an immensely important and useful um, tool in your toolkit as a student, as an academic, as a human being. Is just to be able to reflect on, where did these ideas about drugs or anything come into play? Where did they come into being? What initiated them? How were they formed? Um, in my therapy practice, I often talk to clients about this, and we deconstruct ideas in people's minds on a daily basis, where we talk about, you know, I might hold this certain belief about myself. Well, where did that come from? Who first told me this thing about myself about how I should be? Um, so in this exercise, I want you to ask yourself, what was the source of the knowledge? Where was the source of judgment in each term? What inner messages guided your decisions? So if you chose to put Prozac, for instance, under the medicine column, what inner guidance told you that this is a medicine? Was it the TV commercial that you saw earlier today that said Prozac is a medicine? Or are you coming from a different place where Prozac is just classified as a drug, as is anything else? Um, so really identify for you where where the judgment comes from, and is that even something that's useful to you anymore? So then you can start to ask yourself, if this conditioning came from TV commercials, or it came from someone that I don't necessarily find trustworthy, do I need to still hold on to these belief systems about these certain substances? I know in my era, I grew up during the DARE program era, where we were taught that all drugs are bad, and everyone forgot to define what a drug was. And so what they were implying was that all illegal, illicit drugs are bad. But when you say all drugs are bad, say no to drugs. Um, Technically and quite literally, that means saying no to prescription medications as well, alternative medicines that can be considered drugs, and other things too. So I want you to go ahead and pause the presentation one last time and answer for yourself these questions that I have listed on the bottom of the slide. So go ahead and pause now and reflect on these a little bit before we come back. Okay, and when you're done contemplating these questions on the bottom, hold on to your answers, write them down maybe in front of you, and you might find use for them later in the little writing assignment that I'm going to have for you guys to do. Okay? So hopefully this exercise opened your minds a little bit as to what is a drug, why do we classify drugs as they are, why do we classify some as drugs and some as medicine, and maybe what conditioning goes into each person's different assessment, right? My conditioning growing up with, you know, maybe my conditioning growing up with alcoholism in my family, um, informs how I view alcohol, where I might automatically put it in the problem category, and another person who might grow up with alcohol being, used in a healthy manner in their family might not classify it as a problem. So interesting to reflect on, and hopefully it will spark some questioning, some self-questioning. It's very important in our academic practice. Okay, so there are a lot of different dates and things, movements and policies and tax reforms and all sorts of things that have gone on in drug policy in the United States. And I'm dating this timeline all the way back to the 1860s, all the way to the present. So we got a lot of stuff to cover, and I'm going to just fly right through it. Please feel free to pause and maybe minimize your screen and go look up any of these terms or these specific movements or anything like that if you are particularly interested in any of them. So I'm just meaning to give you guys an entire overview just so you can sort of see how some of these things came to be, and sort of what the movements looked and felt like. So So before the 20th century, in the 1860s, medicine across this country was a real free-for-all. I'm sure you all have seen movies of, traveling traveling cowboys or medicine men that have these wagons behind them, and they sell snake oils and they sell all sorts of remedies for all sorts of things. Um, this was this was common practice back then, and a lot of these products were laced with alcohol, cocaine, opiates, things like that, and very little effort to regulate. So it was a free for all. It was really the wild, wild west uh, here in the United States as far as drugs went. So around 1875, some of the first ever drug control laws were passed in San Francisco, and these were mostly to stop opium dens, but they were largely racially motivated towards towards immigrants from China who, you know, it was a discriminatory practice, and in order to sort of get at that population at the time, this was one of the motivators to really crack down on the opium dens and sort of rip that out from underneath that particular population. And you'll see this throughout the historical overview. A lot of these racial undertones in which different people or different agencies or different parts of the government were trying to um, discriminate against certain racial or gender classes, and they did it through drug policy. So, um, at the beginning of the 20th century, the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed, and this created the Food and Drug Administration. And this is just important because now um, certain drugs, certain compounds had to be accurately labeled with particular content and dosage. And this was really important. This was the first real major effort to try and inform the public, give them some informed consent behind the decisions that they were making with their drug use, and ensuring that those standards were on there carries through today. You'll see, at cannabis dispensaries, they'll have all those sort of labels with content and dosage on them. You go to the grocery store, almost every food product has content and dosage on it, or serving size. And so this was a really big thing that happened in the beginning of drug policy in our country. So again, in early 20th century, smoking opium was banned except for medical uses. This was through the Smoking Opium Exclusion Act. Again, still racially driven in order to, control some aspect of immigrant population's life. Um, so moving forward, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, first massive bans on unlicensed distribution of drugs. So it was the first effort to help regulate distribution by ensuring that people had to be licensed to procure and distribute, and there were standards put on people so that they had some greater credibility, if that makes sense. So then in 1920, the 18th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution goes into effect, which prohibits the sale of alcohol and kickstarts the Prohibition era. I'm sure you all have learned about the Prohibition era in your past academic lives, but this is really a big thing, and it did a lot of damage, unintentional damage to the country and the country's citizenry when they tried to just put an all-out stop and control how people altered their states of consciousness day to day. What actually happened, they were trying to reduce crime and again control certain populations, but what actually happened was it increased organized crime. This is really where a lot of organized crime was born out of. People like Al Capone and things like that. You've heard of some of these people that were massive figures during this time and really profited off of other people, really needing that alcohol. High rates of alcoholism and binge drinking during these times. So not a very, it turned out was not a very successful way to regulate drugs. 1924, federal ban on heroin, enacted through the Anti-Heroin Act, and yeah, we'll get more into that into the next slide. As I mentioned in the last slide, prohibition was not very successful. It it caused a lot more problems than were anticipated, and so in 1933, the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th, making alcohol legal again. And this was seen and felt as a really powerful thing for the citizenry and the people of the United States. They felt at the time that this was an issue that they could all get behind, and then after the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th, there was a lot of celebrating going on, and a lot of people felt like the people have the power now to make these changes. So then in 1937, cannabis starts to become regulated a bit with the Marijuana Tax Act, which placed a tax on cannabis, which didn't explicitly ban it, but it did make it illegal and made it much harder to acquire. And then almost 2 decades down the line, maybe a decade and a half, in 1951, the Boggs Act establishes mandatory minimum sentences. That's a term you all have heard of probably a lot in your time. And these mandatory minimum sentences for small drug offenses become a norm. And they eventually, during the war on drugs, became a huge tool that was extremely powerful for certain bodies within the government to establish control over drug users. So this Boggs Act becomes extremely significant as far as power and control over certain parts of the population. 1956, the Narcotics Control Act, it boosts and increases penalties on marijuana and narcotics trafficking, further pushing out to the public just this is where a lot of the propaganda was coming out at the time, just pushing how bad these things were, and increasing the penalties, making jail sentences much longer for smaller and smaller offenses. In 1965, in the middle of the 60s, hallucinogens are added to an amendment to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, but the specified drugs are not listed. This is probably largely due to the lack of knowledge that these legislators had on these drugs, which is often common in drug policy. Oftentimes the people making the policies have very little knowledge or education around the research with some of these drugs. And so hallucinogens were sort of added as this broad category. And a lot of people, especially in the mid-60s, felt that this was an unscientific and inaccurate way to classify drugs. So later, at the end of the 60s, the ruling Leary versus United States claims that the Marijuana Tax Act violates the Fifth Amendment and is repealed. So that was, again, another win for progressive drug policy, in my opinion. And you'll notice some of the pictures that I have listed here on this slide. Up in the upper left-hand corner, we have a Democrat from New Jersey, and was quoted talking about just how drug policy in the past and in the current times is really going against some of our fundamental value systems around freedom, freedom of consciousness, freedom to alter your body in any way that you want, all sorts of these freedoms that we think are innately given to us through the Constitution are really rubbing up against some of these drug policies in some really nasty ways that don't feel very good. At the lower left-hand corner, you'll just see a report or a cover of a report that came out recently on regulation. I just put this here, even though it's a brand new report. I put the image here just to sort of highlight how regulation has been an iterative process through drug policy history, and how more and more restrictions, taxes, things like that are imposed on drug policy, and it affects society in different ways. Up in the upper right-hand corner, I've included just an image from the Drug Policy Alliance. They're one of my favorite sources for modern day drug policy, especially progressive drug policy ideas and platforms. And they really take a health-centered approach as opposed to a criminogenic approach, which I really appreciate. And we'll get more into that in a few more slides. So all the previous slides were what led up to the war on drugs. You know, we got racism, we have targeting of certain groups, racially motivated and motivated by socioeconomic status, things like that. And regulation coming in. We have restrictions being put on things. We have, you know, government bodies and legislation pushing to restrict more and more how people can explore themselves and heal themselves through medicinal practices with different drugs. So then in 1970, this is really when what we know today as the drug war really kicks off, or the war on drugs. Is actually the term was coined in 71 by President Nixon, but in 1970 is really when a lot of us feel like it kicked off with this Controlled Substances Act, which started to categorize all known drugs into 5 schedules. And I'm sure you guys have all heard this kind of terminology, Schedule 1 through 5. Schedule 1 being the most restrictive class of drugs. This is a place where things like LSD lies. Cannabis is still considered a Schedule 1 drug, even though it's legalized in a lot of other states and our state as well. But all sorts of drugs, peyote, labeled Schedule 1, which means they have no medicinal use whatsoever. And this was a huge, this Controlled Substances Act was a huge power play in order to, you know, the folks who put this into play thought it would be useful in order to help with anything from legal sanctions when people are caught with drugs, helping judges to decide what sort of penalties should be instated. To, you know, folks thought that this would help classify which drugs are worthy of being studied for medicines and would streamline the process of scientific inquiry. But a lot of the unintended effects that came from this still come through today, and a lot of folks who advocate for different drugs that are, you know, misscheduled or misclassified as having no medicinal value. There's a lot of people out there now fighting for the legalization or the decriminalization of a lot of these medicine plants. You know, I have a picture right here of peyote on this book, The Peyote Effect. And if you guys want to go check out sort of peyote's story through all this, it's a really interesting one, which, you know, one of the biggest pieces of the peyote, peyote is sort of one of the front runners in sort of gaining some clearance through Congress as far as like when it can be used. In 78, you'll notice here on the slide, in 1978, peyote becomes allowed within certain circles of Native American Indian populations, and through the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, certain tribes, and I know for sure the Lakota still do this to this day, even here in Colorado. They practice medicine with peyote in a way that culturally for them is like it's a part of their heritage and their cosmology, and it's so very valuable for lots of things in their communities. And so they really fought hard to be able to get this religious freedom, to be able to take this, what they consider a sacrament for them. Others were viewing as like just some way to, you know, trip out on mescaline and you know, Aldous Huxley wrote his famous book, the doors of perception on mescaline and peyote, and so things like this coming out into the public, other writings from Westerners, sort of started to create this culture within the United States where we didn't really know how to talk about drugs. We had different groups of people saying that these drugs are great medicines and we should study them and we should work on making them available to more and more people. And there were an entire other class of people saying, no, these drugs are bad. They're going to rot your brain. They're going to corrupt the youth. And we're going to ban them all. And unfortunately, it was that group of people, the more closed-minded folks, who decided we want to shut down and restrict what folks can ingest and put in their own bodies, sort of so we can control what range of mental attitudes these people under our watch can exhibit, right? So it's a form of social control, a form of control over your mind, control, I know for me, I don't want any government body or anybody else having control over my body and how I experience this life on this planet. And that's what they were trying to do. In 1973, the DEA is established, and I have this picture down here in the bottom, in the middle. This is a famous picture of the DEA arresting Professor Timothy Leary. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of him. He was a Harvard professor who was very good at his job, tenured Harvard professor, and he got arrested in this picture actually, and thrown in prison for a number of years after being exposed as participating in psilocybin mushroom ceremonies. At the time, he and his students were studying a lot of different interesting studies with psychedelics, and so he and his students taking psychedelics together, Harvard caught on and fired him, and the DEA came in and arrested him. He spent some years in prison, but came out and continued to be a leader in the psychedelic movement up until his death a few years ago, but lived a very, very long time. At the bottom here is an image of another report that I've included, this one from 2019, and this is just an interesting reading if you want to go pick it up. It's about this classification system, the Controlled Substances Act, and the categorization, and how initially when folks went about categorizing in 1970 these psychoactive substances, all the science that they had up to that point on a lot of these substances was sort of ignored and really kind of swept under the rug, because a lot of it was showing promising medicinal purposes for these things. And the government did not want that information getting out, and so they classified these drugs and misclassified them and swept all those positive results under the rug. This isn't, the United States isn't the only one to do this. I know I have a friend in the UK who his name is Dr. David Nutt, and he was commissioned by the United Kingdom and their parliament to do an extensive study on the toxicity of all the known psychoactive substances. And he did this great body of work and came out with a chart which you could probably find on Google right now. If you Google Dr. David Nutt, I'm sure it'll be one of the first ones that comes up, but it shows this bar graph of all the toxicities of every substance, showing that some of the most toxic substances are the ones that are legal today, and some of the least toxic substances are the ones that are highly illegal. A lot of the hallucinogens, a lot of those things, highly illegal. And what happened when he tried to publish that and he gave those results to the parliament is they got him fired from his job. They took all the research and refused to publish it. They would not let him have access to it. And he fought for years and years and years to try and get his stuff published, until it finally was published and it came out, and the controversy behind it all came out, and the government in the United Kingdom took a big black eye for that one, for sure. trying to hide that information. So the U.S. has done that, the UK has done that, other countries have done that as well. Okay, so now we get into some more contemporary present overview in this drug policy overview. And there's a couple things that I left out of the slides that I'm going to just sort of insert verbally as I go through them. Some things that you all have lived through and are probably a little more salient or more present for you right now. So first of all, in '85, this is interesting because there's an emergency ban on MDMA, also called Molly. It's commonly found in ecstasy, and it's given a Schedule I status. This is interesting because up until this point, there were literally thousands of peer-reviewed studies published on the efficacy of MDMA in therapy settings, especially for PTSD and marriage and family issues, mainly interrelational type diagnoses and issues, and it was used widely throughout psychiatric communities, as were a lot of other psychedelics were studied up to this point. MDMA is not a classic psychedelic, but it was scheduled and classified along with the rest of hallucinogens, and it still is largely to this day, even though we're finding more and more medicinal uses for it. So that was interesting. That just put a stop to a lot of the research that was going on that was positive towards really ironing out the truth with drugs and how they should be scheduled and how policy should be affected. So that was all put on halt right there. And in '86, Ronald Reagan upped the ante a little bit with the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, giving much more money to drug enforcement and emphasis on mandatory minimum sentences. So this just really increased the amount of spending and manpower and focus that went into sort of trying to squash what Nixon called public enemy number one, which was drug use in the United States. In '98, the federal government commissions the first ever study of drug policy by the National Research Council, and this is extremely surprising because this comes, half a decade or more after people started thinking about initiating, serious drug policy, that they thought, hey, maybe we should evaluate, how some of these drug policies come into be. And what they found was that the federal government didn't spend any time or money studying their own policies, which is probably largely why a lot of their information that they pumped out was propaganda and was from this place of really ignorance about usefulness of a lot of drugs, really just taking a one-sided stance and cherry-picking what they wanted to put out there, and definitely didn't want anybody prying into their reasoning behind why they were doing these things. And yeah, really interesting stuff. So we get a little bit more modern today, and in 2012, Colorado and Washington were the first states to legalize cannabis after so many years of prohibition. And this is a giant leap forward for the entire drug policy system. Not only did it put an emphasis on states' rights and states' abilities to make decisions about drug policy that go against maybe what federal drug policy is, but it also opened the door for us to start considering similar changes to be done with other drugs that are scheduled as cannabis was. Cannabis was scheduled as a Schedule I drug, no medicinal value, and now, it's pretty much common knowledge that cannabis is a medicine. It's sold legally in a ton of states here in the United States as a medicine, and so this starts to open the door for more discussions around maybe other Schedule I drugs have medicinal value, and we just haven't. Maybe we're so programmed by what we've been told and the messages we've been given that we don't want to open up yet to to looking at those. And now we have this perfect opportunity to sort of lay everything back out on the table and really look at the science behind drugs and drug use and their usefulness, and reclassify things if that's how it needs to be done, but maybe reclassify things in ways that make more sense, that are more based on science rather than on sort of socially conditioned ideas. Okay, and now in 2019, last year, psilocybin mushrooms were decriminalized here in Denver, Colorado, and other cities followed in succession. There's a number of cities now that have decriminalized psilocybin mushrooms. Marijuana continues to be legalized state by state, and just last year, all psychoactive plants became decriminalized in Seattle, Washington. This includes everything from ayahuasca, peyote, psilocybin mushrooms. All these are now being considered plant medicines. Some of the other highlights that I didn't put in here, there was a Supreme Court case, and I apologize, I'm blanking on the actual case, but it was between the Santo Daimyo Church, which uses ayahuasca as their sacrament. Ayahuasca is a brew from the Amazon made out of mixing a specific root, with some other leaves, and it's very powerful, very long-acting DMT experience. And this church was using it as their sacrament to sort of connect with their God, and took it all the way to the Supreme Court and won their case, and the Supreme Court granted them the ability to imbibe this psychoactive compound, psychedelic, under the auspices that they do it as part of their ceremonial practice. So again, just like the peyote, this is an interesting way how some of these substances are being reintegrated sort of into our society and overcoming some of the prohibitive restrictions put on them through this spiritual lens. Also recently, and this I think just went into effect a couple months ago, but was passed last year here in Colorado, as the defelonization of possession of all drugs under 4 grams. That happened in Denver as well, which is again another huge step towards what I'll review in a future slide, but this idea of decriminalization and rehabilitation, and treating drug abuse more as a medical issue as opposed to a legal or criminal issue. So this is huge, really dropping the felony penalty for just having personal use drugs on you. Very interesting. We'll see how it pans out. Before you guys leave this slide, if you could please watch this short video about some ideas being proposed by a particular drug policy initiative. They are trying to help educate the public and let them know that there are other ways to go about drug policy, and if you find it useful, please check it out. Okay, now this is one of my favorite parts of drug policy history, just because it's fascinating to me that there are people out there in our history and still currently that know exactly how to manipulate people's minds for good or for evil. And the drug war was certainly an area of our history and of our culture in which propaganda was used to misinform the public and misinform legislators into creating these really draconian laws and restrictions around drugs. So at the top of this page, there's 2 videos that I just want you to watch for sure before you're done with this presentation. One is a short video by Jay-Z, and he talks extensively about how the drug war influenced African American populations here in the United States, and how a lot of drug policy back then as well as currently is still targeted to benefit white people and disadvantage folks who are already being disadvantaged. The second video on the list is another great one. Again, it talks about propaganda and how a lot of the drug policies in the United States have been molded and been put in place, not necessarily just to restrict drugs, but it goes one layer deeper. It goes deeper into trying to control the mind of the masses, to try and keep people, regulated so that they don't question their leaders, so they don't question the government. God forbid, someone in the 60s takes some acid and starts to question the Vietnam War, or starts to question, some of the atrocities being done by the government towards the environment. So they wanted to squash all that out, and some of these videos will show you exactly how they did that. Below, these are not required watching videos, so you don't have to watch them, but the four that I've listed below are optional and quite hilarious videos of propaganda being used in the past. I've tried to give you guys a nice little selection across different decades, so you can sort of see who and how they targeted people at these various points in our history. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this slide. This is a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to try and sort through the propaganda. Okay, just a short slide here to show you a depiction in this image. This is showing a lot of different countries around the world that are doing drug policy different than the US, and are having staggering, amazing beneficial results. Also, it shows some of the how some of the policies that have started here in the US around legalizing cannabis are starting to spread to other countries as well. This is just a tiny sampling of some of the countries that are making changes. One of the more recent ones I heard was Thailand. For a long time been extremely restrictive towards all drugs, including cannabis. The first time I went to Thailand 15 years ago, they said if you get caught with cannabis, you're risking life in jail or execution. I went to Thailand for my honeymoon a year and a half ago, and they had totally changed their song and dance, and they were now saying, cannabis is going to be legalized in the next couple months. And then recently, I read an article saying that it went through. So really progressive, big changes starting to show up. And it's really cool to be alive right now and see sort of this domino effect that, in large part, we here in Colorado start a lot of these movements. Not all of them, but we start a lot of them, and it's cool to see how it ripples out into other communities and other countries, and how they want to approach it. This link at the bottom, I want you to just check this out real quick. This link will guide you to a page that shows the 20 countries with the harshest drug laws, which is sort of the opposite of what I'm showing you here in this diagram. These are more progressive policies, but go check out that list of harsh drug laws. There's a number of countries that you'll just read some of these laws and the penalties for minimal possession or things like that, and these things are still happening. So it's interesting to sort of put the United States in the global context. Like, where are we as a country with our own history in drug policy? How are we evolving within our own system, but also looking at the greater system worldwide and seeing that there are much more progressive drug policy countries than we are, and there are much more restrictive countries and more punitive countries out there than we are. So it's interesting to just kind of put the United States in this larger context and see, where are we and where do we want to go. So this is your in-class assignment that I want you to do, and this is going to be worth 10 points. I've gone ahead and copied and pasted all these instructions onto the discussion board for this class. So go ahead and check it out. What I want you to do is I provided a link both in the instructions for this in the discussion board as well as in the module. There should be a link called Policy Links. If you click on that, there's going to be a section of links in there that will bring you to articles about Portugal's drug policy. I want you to go ahead, and they're just short readings, so go in there and click each one of them, read through those readings, and reflect on them a little bit. Sit with the content that you read in the articles about policy, and sort of do this reflexive practice again, and see how do the values that underlie Portugal's drug policy, how do those either align with my own values, or how do they go against sort of what I believe should happen in drug policy? I really just want you to question, um, where do I sit with the way Portugal does their drug policy? And then I want you to go ahead and write me a reflection, 500 words, pretty short, just addressing some of the following questions. So ask yourself the question, would you prefer a system that is based on decriminalization and sees it more from this health uh, health standpoint, health view, health lens, or would you prefer a system that is based on criminalization, like we currently have, that is based on more punitive responses to drug use? Which do you support and why? What could be some of the benefits and the pitfalls of decriminalization? I really want you to go explore, and maybe through some of these Portugal readings, this will come out for you, but really explore what are some of the benefits and pitfalls, because they're both there. It's not all good and it's not all bad. So I want you to be able to identify both, and maybe even reflect on the United States. What are some of the benefits and pitfalls of the way we do it here too with our current system? Third question, how could the U.S. learn from these alternative policies for future reform? I really just want you to overlay what you learned from the Portugal readings, and think about U.S. policy and how we might be able to learn something from the way Portugal is doing it. And also the last question, what implications could decriminalization have on the drug culture in the U.S.? I just want you to sort of think about a scenario in your mind where if all drugs were decriminalized and we did take on a different sort of model of drug policy, that if there's a paradigm shift and we started viewing drugs and drug use differently, what could be some of the impacts on the culture, on the people? What could be some of the impacts not only for policy, but for things like education and for entertainment and for sports and recreation? What sort of things could come out of this different stance? Just sort of let your mind go a little wild, and include that in your reflection. At the end of your reflection, I'd like you guys to pose one question to your classmates about any of the content today. Maybe there was something that you just sort of didn't understand, or maybe it sparked a question in you and you just really want to know like what other people think about something, or maybe you have an experience to share and want to ask, how does my experience, I can't see how it's colored or shaped by social conditioning. Can anybody help me out on this? So ask a question of your classmates, and then go ahead and respond to two of their questions. So find two of your classmates and respond in one paragraph responses. I'll be back to check to make sure everybody did that. But pretty short, pretty quick exercise. Just want to make sure that you guys get some exposure to alternative policies that are really revolutionizing drug policy internationally. This is just some additional resources for you all. I've included all these links on that policy link Word document that you have access to in the module. But go check out some of these links. Really interesting stuff. Again, this rabbit hole goes deep, and we were just barely looking through that looking glass at the rabbit hole. So go check it out. It's fascinating. I just wanted to spend a couple minutes letting you guys into some of the things that I'm interested in, and some of the things that I'm doing currently in my work. I think I mentioned, or Marie mentioned, I'm a practitioner here in the community. I'm a licensed addiction counselor, a general psychotherapist. I do sport and performance psychology, and I do psychedelic integration therapy. And so I'm a practitioner. That's what I was trained as. That's what's in my heart, is helping people in small groups and individually. But right now in my academic work in the PhD program, I'm really starting to study this idea of evocative models of mental health and wellness. And so our country is largely situated in a suppressive model of medicine where we try and suppress, first of all, we diagnose people as having something wrong with them, which is interesting in and of itself. But then we try and suppress what the symptoms are that come out of that wrongness, right? That dis-ease or physical disease. So we try and suppress the symptoms without trying to actually heal what's underneath, what the real problem is, what started it. And so this new model that's emerging in mental health, largely out of the psychedelic assisted therapy field, is this idea of evocative models of mental health, where instead of trying to suppress emotions in a safe setting, we want to bring up to the surface traumas and bring up difficult emotions and bring up the things that people want to get through and want to work on in therapy. We want to bring those things to the surface and expose them to the light so that so that people can really start to see what's really there and work with them. Sort of this metaphor that I like to use is we're all in this rowboat in this ocean of life, and there's lots and lots of things we have buried deep below the waves that we just don't want to look at, but we know we need to work on. And it's almost like you want those things to float to the surface of the water so you can finally see them and finally start moving them around with your hands and doing things with them. So, um, so yeah, that's really what this evocative model is all about. It's a totally different way to view mental health, and a view of mental health that is more akin to a lot of the indigenous practices around mental health and psychedelic use across the world. A lot of indigenous tribes still use psychoactive substances to bring out sort of um, difficult roadblocks that people are having so that they can work on them. So I mentioned psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. That's really what I'm interested in. I'm trained in that as well. And there's a lot of great studies out there showing great novel treatments for mental and physical wellness. Anything from regrowth of brain cells and neurogenesis with potential applications in Alzheimer's and dementia, to chronic pain and cluster headaches being treated well with psychedelics, to all sorts of mental health issues from anxiety, depression, productivity, creativity, PTSD, performance enhancement. All sorts of things are coming to light as possible benefits of psychedelic assisted therapy. And remember, psychedelics are still classified as Schedule 1 with no medicinal value. So still fighting the good fight on that to open up research and open up practice possibilities. I'm really interested in the biopsychosocial spiritual model of mental health. So most of you are probably familiar with the biopsychosocial. I'm really into holistic human development and see the importance that spirituality and symbolism and meaning making of the immaterial has on all of our lives. And so I'm really interested in bringing that aspect, that spiritual aspect, back into social work. It used to be a part of our everyday lexicon that we would work with clients in the beginnings of social work. But that has largely fallen off, and there's some small pockets still doing like transpersonal social work and stuff, but largely the spiritual aspect is left out of conversations with clients, and a lot of practitioners feel like they're ill-equipped to deal with that very important domain of people's lives. So I'm trying to bring this spiritual aspect back into our training so that we're at least able to work with clients who more and more these days are coming to us with spiritually related issues. So I mentioned transpersonal perspectives. I'm interested in consciousness, and transpersonal just means beyond the self. So beyond what you think you are as a human being, that we are more than just our human self, whatever that looks like for you. We don't try and put any type of major labels on it. It's everybody's different interpretation. I'm also part of a group here in Fort Collins called the Psychedelic Research and Training Institute, and we're doing research currently on ketamine-assisted psychotherapies and cannabis research. We also give trainings to clinicians and therapists if they want to become ketamine-assisted psychotherapists, which will eventually, once some of these substances become legal or more available for practitioners to use, this training will extend into full-on psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So we do a lot over there at Prati, and that's right here in Fort Collins. So Fort Collins is sort of a hub or an epicenter for drug policy and specifically psychedelic work, research, and practice. Our site out here is one of the phase 3 clinical trial sites for the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies that's doing our phase 3 tests on MDMA. So that's going to be a legally prescribable drug very soon. I've recently taken a step into policy myself, and I'm part of the Denver Psilocybin Mushroom Policy Review Panel. Sorry that the image got cut off at the bottom, but once mushrooms were decriminalized in Denver, the mayor selected 11 of us to come together and really start to put together not only education for the community and for first responders and for people dealing with others who are in these altered states, but also determining what the policies and what the regulations and what the laws should look like around decriminalization and around possible legalization and regulation in the future. So that's really exciting stuff. All of our meetings are available to the public, so you can go check those out as well. And lastly, I own and operate my own podcast where I talk about consciousness and freedom over consciousness, a lot of the issues that we talk about here today in this presentation. And so I encourage you guys to go check that out if you want to go a little bit deeper into what some of this material is and how it fits into society currently as well as in history. I have great guests on who are way more knowledgeable on this stuff than I am, but go check that out. I just want to say thank you all for sitting through my really long presentation. There was so much more information I wanted to share, and I really had to work hard to cut it down to what I did. I hope you got a lot out of this. Please do that assignment as soon as you can and respond to some of your peers. And if you have any additional questions for me, or maybe you want some additional resources or direction in any particular way, please reach out to me using any of these methods, and I'll do my best to divert you to whatever knowledge I have, as well as others who might know better than me. Okay, so thanks again, and it was a pleasure.